The grinder screamed against the steel bar, and for a second it sounded too much like another one. The grinder screamed as sparks burst across the hallway wall. Walter didn't blink. He couldn't. The smell of burning metal filled the house, sharp and electric, and for one breath it wasn't Wyoming. It was somewhere else. Ranger pressed against his leg, steady, grounding him, while the welded bar began to split. Whatever was behind that basement door had been sealed on purpose. The steel finally snapped and hit the floor. What would you have done in that moment? The town hall in Red Hollow, Wyoming, smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. The folding chairs were set in uneven rows, metal legs scraping against the cracked linoleum floor whenever someone shifted their weight. A faded American flag hung in the corner, its edges curled from years of dry heat and neglect. Walter Hayes stood near the back wall with his duffel bag at his feet. He didn't sit. He never liked having his back exposed. Ranger stood pressed against his left leg, silent and steady. The German shepherd's amber eyes moved across the room, not restless, just alert. Cataloging, measuring, the way they used to do before stepping into a new AO. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man in a brown jacket that had seen better winters, cleared his throat. Next property, tax delinquent, 2-story structure, outskirts of town, sold as is. A few people glanced at one another. No one raised a hand. Walter had seen the house earlier that morning. Wood siding split and gray, windows boarded over, fence sagging like it had given up arguing with gravity. The kind of place teenagers dared each other to run past at night. Starting bid, the auctioneer said, voice flat. Silence. Someone coughed. Someone else looked down at their boots. Walter felt Ranger's shoulder brush his calf. A quiet reminder. Still here. He raised his hand. The sound was small, just the rustle of denim and fabric. But it was loud enough in that room. A few heads turned. Not welcoming, just curious. Bid received, the auctioneer said quickly, almost relieved. No one countered. The gavel came down with a hollow knock. Sold. Just like that. Walter didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel anything close to excitement. He only felt the weight of winter coming fast across open land. He needed walls, a roof, a place that wasn't a motel off the interstate. As the room emptied, people avoided his eyes. A man in a feed store cap muttered something about bad ground. A woman shook her head as she passed him. Walter didn't ask what they meant. Outside, the sky hung low and heavy, the kind of gray that pressed down on your shoulders. The wind carried dry dirt and the faint smell of pine from the hills. Ranger stepped out first this time, ears high, tail level, scanning the parking lot. You good? Walter asked quietly. Ranger flicked one ear back toward him, then forward again. They walked to Walter's old pickup, paint dulled by years and miles. He tossed the duffel into the passenger seat and rested both hands on the steering wheel before turning the key. He hadn't planned this far ahead. He'd gotten off the bus 3 days ago with a discharge packet, a duffel bag, and a dog who refused to leave his side. No family, no job lined up, no welcome home. Just wide sky and too much quiet. This house wasn't a dream. It was shelter. The road to the property cut away from town and narrowed into gravel. Dead grass bent under the wind. Fence posts leaned like tired men. When the house came into view, it looked worse than it had that morning. The porch sagged slightly on the left side. One shutter hung loose. The yard was nothing but hard dirt and weeds clawing through it. Walter shut off the engine and sat for a moment. Ranger didn't move. "You don't like it either," Walter murmured. The dog's nose twitched, testing the air through the cracked window. Walter stepped out first this time. Boots hit gravel. The wind pushed against him hard and cold. Ranger jumped down beside him and began a slow circle of the yard, head low, measured steps. No barking, no sudden movements, just assessment. Walter climbed the 3 porch steps. The wood creaked but held. He unlocked the front door with the key he'd been handed in town. The hinges groaned. He pushed the door open and stopped. The air inside was clean. Not fresh, not warm, but clean. Light filtered through uncovered windows. The hardwood floors were swept. Furniture stood in place beneath white cloth covers, corners tucked in neatly. There was no thick layer of dust, no rotten smell, no scattered debris from trespassers. Walter took 1 step inside. His boots echoed softly. He waited for Ranger. But Ranger didn't move. The dog stood at the threshold, rigid now, staring past Walter into the dim hallway beyond the living room. Ears forward, body tense. Not fear. Focus. Walter turned his head slowly and followed the line of Ranger's gaze. The hallway was narrow, darker than the rest of the room. At the far end, just visible, was a door set slightly lower than the others. The paint around its frame chipped and uneven. Walter felt something tighten low in his chest. He stepped back onto the porch. Ranger remained still, eyes locked forward. "What is it?" Walter asked under his breath. The dog didn't answer, didn't blink. He just stood there, guarding the doorway and watching the dark. Walter let the silence stretch a few seconds longer. He had learned not to rush a moment like this. In some places, rushing got you hurt. He stepped back inside, slow and steady, keeping one hand near Ranger's collar, but not pulling him forward. The dog's body stayed tense at the threshold, muscles tight beneath his thick coat. "It's clear," Walter said softly, though he wasn't sure yet. Ranger finally crossed the line. The floorboards gave a soft groan under their combined weight. The air carried a faint scent of lemon polish and old wood. Not the smell of rot. Not the smell of animals nesting in walls. Something had been done here. Not recently, but carefully. Walter moved through the living room first. He pulled the white cloth from a side table. No thick dust cloud rose, just a faint shimmer in the afternoon light. The wood beneath was solid oak, polished years ago and left that way. A bookshelf lined the far wall. The books were upright, aligned. No pages curled from moisture. He crouched and ran a finger along the baseboard. Clean. Outside, the porch sagged. The yard was dead. Windows were boarded. Inside, it felt sealed. Ranger walked ahead this time, nose low. He stopped at the hallway entrance again. His tail didn't wag. It didn't tuck either. It stayed level. Walter followed. The hallway was narrow and dim. A single bulb hung overhead. He reached up and flicked the switch. The light came on. That made him pause. Power wasn't supposed to be active on properties like this. Not after years of unpaid taxes. He glanced at the breaker panel on the wall near the kitchen. It had been replaced at some point. Not new, but not ancient either. "Somebody kept this place alive," he muttered. Ranger's ears twitched. Walter moved toward the kitchen. The cabinets were shut tight. He opened one. Dishes were stacked inside, wrapped in brown paper, labeled in careful handwriting. Plates, glasses, silverware. He stared at the writing. Neat, deliberate, not rushed. This wasn't abandonment. It was preparation. He opened the refrigerator. Empty, clean, unplugged. The sink had no rust stains. The pipes under it looked intact. Whoever left this house had expected someone else to come back. Walter stepped into the hallway again. At the far end, the door Ranger had been watching stood slightly lower than the others. No knob, just a thick metal latch welded across it. The steel bar was bolted into the frame with heavy screws, not decorative, functional. Ranger approached it slowly and sat down in front of it. He didn't scratch, didn't bark. He just watched. Walter crouched beside him. The metal was cold beneath his palm. The welds were rough, like someone had done it fast but meant it to hold. "This is what you don't like," Walter said. Ranger leaned forward slightly, nose inches from the crack beneath the door. Walter listened. Nothing. No movement. No shifting wood. No faint hum. But the air near the door felt different. Cooler. He stood and stepped back. He could cut that steel. It wouldn't take long. A grinder from the truck. 10 minutes, maybe less. But that would mean commitment. It would mean stepping past curiosity into something else. He wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, he turned away and moved toward the staircase at the end of the hall. The steps creaked but didn't sag. Upstairs held 2 bedrooms and a small study. One room was bare. The other had a made bed. Quilt pulled tight. Curtains half drawn. A thin layer of dust rested on the windowsill. Not years of dust. Months. Walter felt his jaw tighten. He stepped back downstairs and returned to the living room. The wind rattled one of the boarded windows. The house didn't feel haunted. It didn't feel dangerous. It felt intentional. Ranger padded into the living room and lay down, but not fully relaxed. His head stayed up, eyes open. Walter dropped his duffel near the fireplace. He knelt and checked the flue. Clear. Someone had cleaned it before leaving. He stacked a few pieces of dry wood from the pile outside and struck a match. The fire caught quickly, too quickly. The wood was dry and cut to even lengths. He sat back on his heels and watched the flames take shape. "Why board the windows?" he murmured, "if you wanted the inside to last." Ranger shifted closer to him. Walter leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment. The house creaked softly as the temperature shifted. The wind outside grew sharper. Night would fall fast out here. He opened his eyes and looked toward the hallway again. The welded door sat at the end like a sentence unfinished. He wasn't afraid of what might be behind it. He was wary of what it might mean. Outside, snow began to drift down in thin, dry sheets. It brushed against the boarded windows and settled along the porch rail. Inside, the fire warmed the air. Ranger stood again, without being called. He walked back down the hallway and stopped at the metal-latched door. This time he lowered his body until he was lying across it, guarding it. Walter rose slowly and followed. "Easy," he said quietly. Ranger didn't move. Walter rested his hand on the dog's neck, felt the steady pulse beneath fur and scar tissue. The scar along Ranger's flank pulled slightly as he adjusted position. A reminder of another explosion, another door forced open in another country. Walter swallowed. "This isn't that," he said under his breath. Ranger's breathing slowed, but he did not leave the spot. Walter looked at the steel bar one more time. "Tomorrow," he said finally. He turned off the hallway light and walked back toward the fire. Behind him, Ranger stayed where he was, watching the door, watching whatever waited beyond it. Walter let Ranger hold the hallway through the night. He didn't force him away, didn't drag him back to the fire. If the dog believed something mattered, Walter had learned to respect that. Morning came pale and brittle, the kind of cold that tightens the joints before you even stand up. Frost coated the inside edges of the boarded windows. The fire had burned low, leaving only gray ash and a faint line of warmth across the floorboards. Ranger was still there, not asleep. Waiting. Walter rose quietly, stretched the stiffness from his shoulders, and walked to the front door. He needed information before he needed answers. Town first, basement later. Red Hollow looked smaller in daylight. A single gas pump. A grocery store with a hand-painted sign in the window. The post office attached to a brick building that might have once been a bank. Walter parked along the curb and stepped out. Ranger followed, tail level, posture calm but attentive. The bell above the office door chimed when Walter entered the municipal building. A woman in her late 50s sat behind a desk stacked with folders and old maps. Short gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, a cardigan folded neatly over her shoulders. She looked up, studied him, then looked down at Ranger. "You must be the one who bought the house on Ashwood Ridge," she said. Walter nodded. "Walter Hayes." "Martha Doyle," she replied. "Town clerk." Her eyes softened just slightly when she glanced at Ranger again. "He looks disciplined." "He is." Walter stepped closer to the counter. "I was hoping you could tell me about the property, why it sat empty." Martha's hand paused over the file she was sorting. "That house," she said carefully, "belongs to a story most folks prefer not to tell." Walter waited. He had gotten used to silence as a negotiation tool. Martha pulled open a drawer and slid out a thin folder. The paper inside was yellowed, edges curled with time. "Owned by Daniel Mercer," she said. "Lived there alone for years. Quiet man. Didn't owe anyone much." "What happened to him?" "He passed. Natural causes. No next of kin. Property went to tax sale after back payments fell through." Walter studied her face. "That's the simple version." Martha held his gaze for a long second. "He had opinions," she added softly, "about land use. About a proposal a few years back." "What proposal?" Before she could answer, the door behind Walter opened, heavy boots on tile. Walter didn't turn immediately. Ranger did. The dog shifted, stepping slightly forward, positioning himself between Walter and the sound without being told. "Morning, Martha." The voice was smooth, controlled. Walter turned then. A tall man in his early 40s stood near the door. Clean jacket, clean boots, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Councilman Brooks," Martha said quietly. Brooks stepped forward, hands in his coat pockets. "You settling in all right, Mr. Hayes?" Walter nodded once. "Working on it." Brooks glanced toward Ranger. "Fine dog." Ranger didn't blink. "Appreciate it," Walter said. Brooks shifted his weight. "I heard you've been asking about the Mercer place." "Just trying to understand what I bought." Brooks chuckled softly. "You bought a house, that's all. Old one. Needs work." Walter didn't respond. Brooks continued. "Daniel Mercer had strong feelings about a development project. Wanted to keep county land from being sold off. Caused tension. Nothing dramatic. And nothing, Brooks said lightly. The project didn't move forward. Life goes on. Martha's hands tightened slightly around the folder. Walter noticed. So why board the windows? He asked. Brooks tilted his head. Vandalism. Folks get curious about empty houses. Best to discourage it. Ranger let out a low, steady breath. Not a growl, just a sound. Brooks glanced down at him, then back up. Look, Brooks said, voice lowering just a fraction. Small towns survive on stability. Digging around in old disagreements doesn't help anyone. Walter met his eyes. I'm not digging, just asking. Brooks smiled again. Good. Keep it that way. The room held stillness like a held breath. Finally, Brooks stepped back toward the door. Welcome to Red Hollow, he said. Then he left. The bell chimed again. Martha waited until the door shut fully before speaking. He didn't tell you the whole thing, she said. I figured. Martha leaned closer across the desk. Mercer believed portions of county land were undervalued, sold below market to private buyers. He fought it at meetings, brought paperwork, caused noise. What kind of paperwork? Old agreements, boundary surveys, easement records. She hesitated. He said he kept copies at home. Walter felt something click into place. In the basement? He asked quietly. Martha's eyes flickered. I don't know that, she said. But I know this. The house didn't sit empty because it was worthless. She closed the folder. It sat empty because nobody wanted to open what was left inside. Walter stepped back from the counter. Ranger moved with him, never turning his back on the door. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Walter crouched beside Ranger once they reached the sidewalk. You hear that? He murmured. Ranger's ears lifted slightly. Walter looked back toward the municipal building. Some houses are abandoned, some are avoided. He stood. Let's go home, he said. Ranger walked beside him without hesitation, and for the first time since unlocking the front door, Walter understood. The house on Ashwood Ridge wasn't empty. It was waiting. Walter felt that in his bones the moment he stepped back onto Ashwood Ridge. The wind had shifted. Snow drifted sideways across the yard, thin and dry, catching in the broken fence like ash. The house stood quiet against it, patient. Ranger trotted ahead, nose low, then stopped at the porch steps and looked back once. Walter didn't hesitate this time. Inside, the air felt the same as before, still, held together. The hallway waited at the end of the living room, narrow and dim, that welded bar across the basement door catching the pale light from the kitchen. Walter set his duffel against the wall and walked back out to the truck. He returned with a small grinder, an extension cord, and a steady look in his eyes. Ranger followed without being called. Walter plugged the cord into the kitchen outlet. The hum of electricity running through the line sounded louder than it should have. Too sharp. Too familiar. He paused. He could almost hear the echo of metal on metal in another country. The high-pitched whine of cutting through reinforced doors. The crack of something about to give. He blinked hard. This is not that, he said under his breath. Ranger stood at his right side, not touching him, just present. Walter knelt in front of the steel bar. The welds were rough, the screws thick and driven deep into the frame. Whoever did this wanted it shut, he muttered. He switched on the grinder. The noise exploded through the hallway. Bright sparks jumped against the wall, scattering in quick bursts. The metal shrieked under pressure. Walter's shoulders tightened instinctively. For half a second, his breath caught. His heart jumped like it was waiting for impact. Ranger pressed against his leg. Not panicked. Grounded. Walter slowed his breathing and kept cutting. The first weld gave way with a sharp snap. The steel bar sagged slightly on one side. He adjusted his angle and cut again. The second weld cracked. The bar dropped to the floor with a heavy thud that echoed through the house. Silence followed, thick and heavy. Walter switched off the grinder. The only sound now was Ranger's steady breathing. Walter placed his hand on the basement door. Cold. He lifted the latch and pulled. The door resisted at first, then opened with a slow, reluctant creak. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Ranger stepped forward, but did not rush. Walter flicked on his flashlight and shone it down the steps. Concrete walls, bare, no visible movement, no sound. He descended first. Boots, careful, measured. The basement was larger than he expected. The air smelled dry, not damp, not moldy. A single small window near the ceiling let in a line of weak daylight. The space was organized. Shelving lined one wall. Boxes stacked neatly. A workbench stood against the far side with tools arranged in order. Walter frowned. This wasn't panic, he said quietly. This was planning. Ranger moved past him and began circling the room, nose sweeping along the floor. He paused near a stack of wooden crates, then moved on. Walter approached the shelves. Files. Not random papers. Not junk. Folders labeled by year. Town council minutes. Land assessments. Survey maps. He pulled one down and opened it. Inside were copies of meeting transcripts, not official prints, personal copies, notes written in the margins in tight handwriting. Walter flipped through a few pages. Property lines marked in red. Sale values circled. Question marks written beside signatures. Ranger let out a short, low huff. Walter turned. The dog stood near the back corner where the concrete floor met the wall. He pawed once at the ground. Not digging hard, just enough to mark the spot. Walter crossed the room and knelt. The concrete here looked slightly darker than the rest. Not broken, just patched. He tapped it with the handle of his flashlight. Hollow. Ranger's ears lifted. Walter set the flashlight down and ran his fingers along the edge. There was a faint seam, square, maybe 2 feet across. He stood and grabbed a pry bar from the workbench. It took effort. The cement cover had been set carefully, not sloppy, not temporary. After a few minutes of controlled leverage, the square slab shifted. Dust rose in a thin cloud. Walter pulled it aside. Beneath was a metal box, weather-sealed, tight. He stared at it for a long moment. No gold glinting. No stacks of cash. Just steel. Ranger sat down beside him. Walter lifted the box out and set it on the workbench. His hands felt steady now. Clear. He unlatched it. Inside were more documents. Copies of land transfer agreements, survey corrections, letters addressed to county officials, a few photographs of boundary markers that had been moved. At the bottom lay a folded packet thicker than the rest. Walter opened it slowly. A transfer agreement, signed. The name at the top, Councilman Brooks. Walter's jaw tightened. The sale price listed below market value. County land adjacent to Ashwood Ridge. Reclassified. Quietly. Ranger shifted closer, pressing his shoulder against Walter's knee. Walter exhaled slowly. "No treasure," he murmured. He looked around the basement again. The shelves, the order, the effort. Daniel Mercer hadn't hidden money, he'd hidden proof. Proof that something in this town had not been what it seemed. Walter closed the box carefully. The house above them creaked softly in the wind. He wasn't chasing a rumor anymore. He was standing in the middle of it. Ranger rose and walked toward the staircase, then paused and looked back. Walter picked up the metal box and followed. Upstairs, the fire had burned down to embers. He set the box on the dining table and removed the top folder again. One page slipped loose and fell to the floor. Walter bent to pick it up. His eyes froze on the signature at the bottom. The ink looked older, the paper worn, but the signature was clear and disputed. Walter stood slowly. Outside, snow thickened. Inside, the house felt less like shelter and more like a witness. Walter stood in the dining room for a long time. The packet spread across the table beneath the dim kitchen light. Snow tapped against the boarded windows in thin, restless bursts. Ranger lay at his feet, chin on paws, but his eyes never fully closed. The signature stared back at Walter. Brooks. Not rumor, not hearsay. Ink on paper. Walter gathered the documents into careful stacks. He did not rush. He had learned that moving too fast around fragile truths only made them break in the wrong way. By mid-afternoon, headlights crawled up the ridge road. Ranger was on his feet before the engine cut. Walter stepped to the window. A dark pickup. Clean. Not local farm dust. Brooks stepped out, collar turned up against the cold. Walter opened the door before the knock came. "Mr. Hayes," Brooks said, smiling like they were meeting over coffee. "Councilman." Ranger stood beside Walter, not barking, not growling, just present. Brooks glanced down at him. He's protective. He's observant. Brooks nodded once and stepped inside without waiting to be invited. He looked around the living room briefly. His gaze flicked toward the hallway. "Settling in?" he asked. "Getting there." Brooks clasped his hands together. "I hear you've been organizing." Walter didn't answer. Brooks continued. "Daniel Mercer was stubborn. Good man in some ways. But he had a habit of keeping things that caused more trouble than they solved." Walter felt Ranger shift closer. "Paper can be misunderstood," Brooks said gently. "Numbers, old surveys. Context gets lost." "Context doesn't change ink," Walter replied. Brooks's smile thinned. "I'm not here to argue," he said. "I'm here to make this simple. You're new. You bought a house no one wanted. That's fine. But you don't need to inherit old disputes." Walter leaned against the doorframe. "Go on." Brooks reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. He set it on the table. "Relocation costs," he said. "More than fair. Enough to help you get somewhere better suited." Walter didn't touch the envelope. Ranger's ears tipped forward. Brooks lowered his voice. "You've served your country. You deserve peace, not small-town headaches." Walter's jaw tightened slightly. Peace. He almost laughed at the word. "You offering me peace, Shroom?" Walter said quietly. "Or silence?" Brooks held his gaze. "I'm offering you a clean start." The house creaked in the wind. Walter walked to the table and picked up the envelope. He weighed it in his hand. Cash. Thick enough to matter. Thin enough to insult. He set it back down. "I haven't decided anything," Walter said. Brooks studied him. "That's fine. But understand something. This town depends on stability. Old disagreements can cost people jobs, investments, trust." "Whose trust?" Walter asked. Brooks didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "Think about it. No one's asking you to fight anyone. Just let the past stay buried." Ranger stepped forward then, placing himself between Brooks and the table. Not aggressive, firm. Brooks glanced down at the dog, then back at Walter. "You have 48 hours, he said. "After that, things get complicated." He turned and walked out without another word. The truck engine started, faded down the road. Silence returned. Walter stood still. 48 hours. Ranger nudged his leg gently. Walter sank into a chair and stared at the envelope. Money meant mobility. Warm motels. No frost creeping along window edges. No tension at town meetings. No names whispered when he walked into a store. He rubbed his face with both hands. Night fell hard. The wind picked up again. A loose board somewhere outside banged against the siding. Walter jerked upright before he realized he had fallen asleep. His pulse raced. For a second, he was back somewhere else. A different night. A different sound. Waiting for something worse to follow. Ranger was already standing beside him. Not alarmed, just steady. Walter exhaled slowly. "Stand down," he murmured. The banging came again. Just wood. Just wind. He stood and checked the front door anyway. Old habits. Ranger followed. Walter returned to the table and opened the metal box again. He pulled out another stack of papers and flipped through them carefully. At the bottom of one folder, folded between survey copies, was a single sheet that didn't match the rest. Not official. Handwritten. He unfolded it. The words were short. "If you're reading this, you found what I couldn't let disappear. I tried to fight it alone. That was my mistake." Walter stared at the line, signed only with a first name, Daniel. Ranger rested his chin on Walter's knee. Walter swallowed hard. He had walked away from enough things in his life. Orders, cities, people he couldn't save. This wasn't combat. No gunfire. No smoke. Just ink and silence. But silence could do damage too. He folded the note carefully and set it apart from the rest. Outside, the snow thickened, muting the world into a soft, gray quiet. Walter picked up the envelope Brooks had left and weighed it once more. 48 hours. He looked down at Ranger. "What do you think?" he asked softly. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. Not a command, just presence. Walter set the envelope aside, unopened. He reached for the phone on the counter instead. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he began scrolling through local contacts Martha had scribbled on a sticky note earlier that day. One name stood out. A regional reporter who covered county matters. Walter didn't dial yet. He leaned back in his chair and listened to the wind push against the house. 48 hours. The house wasn't just a witness anymore. It was asking him to choose. Walter didn't sleep much. The envelope Brooks had left stayed where it was on the corner of the table, untouched. He didn't throw it away. Didn't open it either. It sat there like a quiet test. At dawn, the snow had stopped. The world outside the house looked washed clean. White fields, pale sky. No footprints except the ones Ranger had made circling the yard before coming back inside. Walter poured black coffee and sat at the table again. The handwritten note from Daniel Mercer lay open beside him. I tried to fight it alone. Walter read that line 3 times. He knew what that felt like. Ranger rested under the table close enough that Walter's boot brushed his fur. The dog shifted when Walter leaned forward, but didn't move away. Walter pulled the rest of the papers toward him. He went through them slower this time. Not looking for proof, looking for context. Meeting dates, survey adjustments, margin notes written in tight handwriting. A pattern emerged the more he read. Parcel lines redrawn just before votes. Appraisals changed by small but meaningful amounts. Land labeled non-essential despite being used for grazing and shared access roads. Nothing explosive, nothing dramatic. Just small shifts, small enough to hide in paperwork. Walter leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't about money, he said quietly. It was about leverage, control, the kind that never shows up in headlines. Ranger's ears twitched at the tone in Walter's voice. Walter picked up the phone again. This time he dialed. The call rang longer than he expected. Carter Hill, a man's voice answered finally. Calm, direct. My name is Walter Hayes, Walter said. I bought the Mercer place. A pause. I heard, Carter replied. That house has been quiet a long time. It shouldn't have been, Walter said. I found something. Another pause. Longer. You're not the first person to think that, Carter said carefully. I have documents, Walter continued. Copies of agreements, survey changes. They're organized, not rumors. The line stayed silent for a few seconds. Send me photos, Carter said at last. We'll start there. Walter ended the call and felt something shift in his chest. Not relief, not fear. Direction. Ranger stood and walked to the hallway. The basement door now stood open. No more steel bar. Walter followed him down the steps again. In the daylight, the basement looked less ominous. Just concrete and shelving and workbench. Evidence doesn't look dramatic when it's stacked neatly in folders. Walter set up his phone and began photographing the documents. Page after page. Close-ups of signatures, dates, red-lined maps. Ranger lay at the bottom of the stairs, watching the room. When Walter finished, he leaned against the workbench and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about Brooks's words. 48 hours. About stability. About jobs. Walter had worn uniforms long enough to know that stability can be another word for silence. He climbed back upstairs and sent the files. By afternoon, Carter called back. These are real, he said. At least they look real. Enough to raise questions. That's all they were ever meant to do, Walter replied. You understand this won't stay quiet, Carter said. If we run this, there'll be pushback. Walter looked around the dining room. At the boarded windows, the sealed cabinets, the care someone had taken before leaving. It hasn't been quiet, he said. Just contained. Ranger moved to his side again, pressing his shoulder lightly against Walter's leg. Give me 24 hours, Carter said. I'll verify what I can. Walter hung up. 24 hours. Less than Brooks had offered. The afternoon wore on slowly. A truck drove past once, slowed, kept going. Walter stepped outside and began clearing snow from the front path. Not because he expected visitors, because he needed his hands busy. Ranger worked the yard with him, checking the perimeter, nose to the wind. Near the broken fence line, Ranger stopped and stared toward the road. Walter followed his gaze. No vehicle, no figure, just open land and quiet. "You think he'll come back?" Walter asked softly. Ranger didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night, Walter left the lights on downstairs. Not all of them. Just enough. He didn't barricade the door. Didn't pack the papers away. He sat at the table again with the handwritten note in front of him. Daniel Mercer had tried to fight it alone. Walter understood now why that mattered. The house hadn't been preserved for a buyer. It had been preserved for a witness. Ranger settled beside his chair and let out a long, slow breath. Walter reached down and scratched behind his ear. "I'm not fighting alone," he said quietly. Outside, the wind moved gently through the snow. Inside, the house felt less like a burden and more like a line drawn in the ground. By noon the next day, that line had moved beyond the ridge. Walter heard about it from the gas station first. He had stopped in for diesel and coffee. The old television mounted above the cooler flickered with local news. Closed captions scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "County land deal under review." Walter didn't need to hear the reporter's voice to know what that meant. Carter Hill had run it. Not explosive, not dramatic. Just facts. Survey discrepancies, meeting transcripts, signatures, questions. When Walter stepped back outside, two men standing near the ice machine stopped talking mid-sentence. One looked at him openly. The other looked away. Ranger stood beside him, tail neutral, ears forward. "Guess we're not invisible anymore," Walter murmured. By evening, the ridge felt different. A pickup slowed at the end of the dirt road and idled there for a few seconds before driving off. No one knocked. No one shouted. But the quiet had changed. It wasn't empty now. It was watching. Walter stacked wood on the porch before dark. The air carried that thin metallic smell that comes before another freeze. Ranger paced the fence line twice, nose low, checking for unfamiliar scents. "Clear," Walter said softly, though he knew that word didn't apply the same way here. After dinner, Walter sat at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold. The news article lay open on his phone. Comments had already started appearing under it. Some thanked the reporter. Some called it exaggeration. Some called him an outsider stirring trouble. Walter closed the screen. He had expected resistance. He hadn't expected the heaviness. Ranger lifted his head suddenly. A second later, something struck the wooden fence out front. A sharp crack. Walter was on his feet before he registered moving. His body reacted first. Heart rate up, muscles tight. Ranger barked once, deep, commanding. Another object hit the boards. Walter stepped to the window and looked through the narrow gap between the planks. Two silhouettes at the edge of the road. Hard to make out faces in the dark. "Go home," he called out. Calm, controlled. The figures hesitated. Then one of them threw something else toward the yard. It landed short and rolled to a stop. Ranger's growl deepened. Walter placed a hand on his collar. "Stand down," he said. The truck engine revved and pulled away. Silence returned quickly, too quickly. Walter stepped outside with a flashlight. Ranger stayed at his left side, body angled slightly outward. The object in the yard was just a rock. No note. No threat written in paint. Just a rock. Walter bent and picked it up. Cold. Ordinary. He tossed it aside. The fence board that had been hit cracked near the nail. Walter fetched a hammer and spare plank from the shed and began repairing it under the porch light. His movements were steady, measured, no wasted energy. Ranger stood guard at the corner of the house. Walter didn't chase the truck, didn't shout into the night. He drove the nail in clean. Wood against wood. Repair instead of retaliation. Inside, the house felt smaller now, the air tighter. Walter washed his hands at the sink and looked at his reflection in the dark window. The man staring back looked older than 38. Ranger nudged his elbow. "I know," Walter said quietly. He turned off most of the lights but left the porch lamp on. Sometime past midnight, he woke again. Not from sound, from stillness. He listened. Wind through dry branches, the faint creak of cooling boards. Ranger was already up, positioned near the front door. Not tense, just alert. Walter walked over and rested his hand on the doorframe. "You don't scare easy," he said to the dark. He wasn't sure if he meant the people on the road, or himself. Morning came with pale sun and brittle air. When Walter stepped outside, he noticed something else. 2 tire tracks cut across the frost near the mailbox, close enough to show intention, not close enough to prove anything. He stood there a moment, taking it in. Then he grabbed the shovel and cleared the driveway. Around mid-morning, a truck approached slowly up the ridge. Walter tensed automatically. Ranger did not bark this time. It was Martha. She stepped out, cheeks red from the cold. "I saw the article," she said without greeting. Walter nodded. "So did everyone else," she added. She glanced at the cracked fence board. "They'll push," she said. "They don't like questions." "I don't like rocks," Walter replied. Martha almost smiled. "The county's calling a public meeting," she said. "Tomorrow night. They're reviewing the proposal. They can't ignore it now." Walter absorbed that. "Good," he said. Martha looked at Ranger, then back at Walter. "You're not alone in this," she said quietly. Walter didn't answer right away. He wasn't used to that sentence. When she drove off, the ridge felt less isolated, not safe, but shared. Walter turned back toward the house. Snow from the previous storm had begun to melt along the edges of the yard. The dark earth beneath showed through in uneven patches. Change rarely arrived clean. Ranger trotted ahead of him toward the porch. Walter paused at the steps and looked out over the land. He had drawn a line. Now the town was deciding which side of it they stood on. The meeting was held in the same town hall where Walter had bought the house. Same folding chairs, same cracked floor, same faded flag in the corner. But this time the room was full. People stood along the walls, arms crossed, faces tight. A low hum of conversation rolled through the air like distant thunder. Walter entered quietly. Ranger walked beside him without pulling on the leash. No vest, no badge, just presence. A few heads turned. Whispers followed. "That's him." "Mercer House." Walter didn't react. He chose a seat near the aisle back close to the wall. Ranger lay down at his feet immediately, head up, watching. Councilman Brooks sat at the long table in front, papers stacked neatly, jaw set, a calm expression practiced enough to be convincing. Martha Doyle took a seat 2 chairs down from him. She didn't look at Walter, but she didn't look away either. The county supervisor called the room to order. "We're here to review questions raised about the land reassignment 3 years ago," he said. "We'll hear statements. Then we'll determine next steps." Brooks stood first. His voice was steady, measured. "The reassignment followed proper procedure," he said. "Appraisals were conducted. Votes were recorded. This is political noise created by partial information." Murmurs rose. Walter kept his eyes on the table in front of him. He had stood in rooms louder than this. Rooms where shouting meant something worse followed. This was different. No weapons. No dust. Just words. The supervisor nodded toward the audience. "Mr. Hayes?" Walter rose slowly. Ranger remained lying down. Walter carried a thin folder. Not dramatic, not heavy. He walked to the front without rushing. "I bought the Mercer property," he began. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "I didn't come looking for a fight." A few people shifted. "I found copies of land surveys and meeting notes," he continued. "They show boundary adjustments made shortly before the vote to reclassify the land." He opened the folder and handed the top sheet to the supervisor. "Original survey," Walter said, "and the revision, side by side." The supervisor studied the pages. Brooks leaned forward slightly. "Copies," he said. "Unverified." Walter nodded once. "That's fair. Verify them." A ripple moved through the room. Walter didn't point fingers, didn't accuse. He just laid out the pages on the table. "The grazing access road that serves 3 ranches," he said calmly. "It disappears in the revised map, marked as non-essential." A man in the back stood up. "That road's been there since my father's time." Another voice chimed in. "We use that in winter." Brooks held up a hand. "Those routes were rerouted." "On paper," someone replied. The room grew louder. Ranger shifted under Walter's chair but did not bark. His ears rotated slowly, tracking the energy in the room. Walter waited. When the noise peaked, he spoke again. "I'm not here to win anything," he said. "If the paperwork is correct, then it stands. But if it's not, the town deserves to know." Silence followed that. Not complete, but enough. Martha Doyle stood next. "I reviewed the meeting minutes from that session," she said. "There are discrepancies in recorded parcel numbers." Brooks turned toward her. "Martha." She didn't sit down. "I'm not accusing," she said evenly. "I'm saying it deserves review." The supervisor rubbed his forehead. "This board will authorize an independent review of the reassignment documents," he said finally. "Effective immediately." The words hung in the air. Not a victory, not yet. But movement. Brooks remained seated. His expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. "This town doesn't need division," he said quietly. Walter met his gaze. "Then let's remove doubt," he replied. The meeting adjourned in low conversation and stiff nods. As people filed out, some avoided Walter. Others paused briefly. A rancher with sunburned skin extended a hand. "Name's Eli Parker," he said. "My fence line's on that map." Walter shook his hand. "Walter." "Appreciate you bringing it forward," Eli said. "Takes guts." Walter almost said something modest. Instead, he nodded. Ranger stood when Walter did. As they stepped outside, the night air hit sharp and clean. No one threw rocks this time, but no one smiled either. Walter walked to his truck under the yellow glow of the streetlight. He felt no surge of triumph, just a steady weight. The line had moved. Now it ran through the center of town. Walter felt it the next morning at the hardware store. The clerk, who had once nodded at him without thinking, now kept his answers short. A man near the paint aisle stared openly, then turned his back. No insults, no threats, just distance. Walter paid for fence staples and a new shovel handle. Cash. Exact change. Outside, Ranger waited in the truck bed, head lifted, watching the parking lot like it was a perimeter worth guarding. "Still clear?" Walter asked quietly as he climbed in. Ranger's tail thumped once. Clear enough. The independent review had begun. Word spread fast in Red Hollow. The county hired an outside surveyor. Files were pulled. Old votes re-examined. It should have felt like progress. Instead, it felt like pressure. 2 days later, Walter received a call from the rancher he had met after the meeting. "Walter," Eli Parker said, voice tight, "I heard you were looking for day labor." "I was," Walter replied. He had mentioned it in passing. Extra cash never hurt. "Sorry," Eli said. "My uncle says bringing you on right now would complicate things." Walter understood the unspoken part. Complicate contracts. Complicate supply agreements. "Understood," Walter said. He hung up and stood on the porch for a long time. He had enough saved to last a few months. Not forever. Ranger nudged his hand. "I didn't expect applause," Walter murmured. That afternoon, he worked on the fence again. The board that had been cracked by the thrown rock had been replaced, but he reinforced the entire line anyway. Post by post. Snow melted into mud beneath his boots. The air carried that damp, early spring smell. Change coming, but not settled yet. Ranger patrolled the outer edge of the yard. Near sunset, a sharp bark cut across the field. Walter straightened immediately. Ranger stood near the broken fence line at the back corner of the property. His body was angled outward, fur along his spine raised slightly. Walter jogged over. 2 stray dogs lingered near the tree line. Thin, nervous, not aggressive, but hungry enough to test boundaries. Ranger held his ground. Walter stepped between Ranger and the fence. "Easy," he said quietly. The strays backed off slowly, retreating into the brush. Ranger didn't chase them. He stayed exactly where he was until they disappeared from view. Walter crouched beside him and ran a hand along his side. That's when he saw it. A thin line of blood along Ranger's front leg, not deep, just a scrape, probably from the fence wire during the standoff. Still, Walter's chest tightened more than it should have. He brought Ranger inside and cleaned the cut at the kitchen sink. The dog stood still, trusting. No flinch, no complaint. "It's nothing," Walter said softly. "Just a scratch." But as he wrapped the small bandage, he felt something heavier. Responsibility. This wasn't just about land now. It was about what staying meant. That evening, as darkness settled, headlights appeared again at the edge of the road. Walter's shoulders tensed, but the truck slowed and turned into the driveway. Eli Parker stepped out, hat in hand. "I can't offer you work," Eli said plainly. "Not right now." Walter nodded. "But I can say this," Eli continued. "That road you pointed out? My father built that stretch himself. If the review clears it up, it matters." Walter looked at him steadily. "Appreciate that," he said. Eli shifted his weight, then reached into his truck bed and lifted out a box. Fresh bread, a jar of preserves, a sack of potatoes. Figured you might need these more than I do, Eli said. Walter hesitated. He wasn't used to accepting help. Ranger stepped forward and sniffed Eli's hand. Eli smiled faintly. He's a good one. He is, Walter replied. When Eli drove off, the yard felt less empty. Walter carried the box inside and set it on the table. Ranger lay down beside the chair, head resting on his paws. Walter sat and stared at the wall for a long time. He could still sell the house. Walk away. No more tension. No more slow glances in town. No more rocks. But he thought about Daniel Mercer. About fighting alone. About Ranger standing between him and two hungry strays without hesitation. Walter leaned down and rested his forehead briefly against Ranger's head. "We're not leaving," he said quietly. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. Outside, the wind moved gently through the bare branches. Inside, the house felt steadier. Staying had a cost, but so did walking away. The review took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of tight smiles at the gas station. 3 weeks of silence when Walter entered a room. 3 weeks of waiting. He didn't count the days out loud. Ranger did it differently. Each morning, the dog made his round of the yard, checked the fence line, paused at the edge of the road, then returned to the porch like he was marking time. The call came just after noon on a Tuesday. Walter was under the truck, replacing a worn brake line. Ranger lay in the shade nearby, watching the ridge. Walter's phone buzzed on the workbench. He wiped his hands on a rag and answered. It was the county supervisor. "The independent survey confirmed discrepancies," the man said plainly. "Parcel lines were adjusted without full disclosure. The reassignment vote is being nullified pending further review." Walter leaned against the side of the truck. "And the land?" he asked. "It reverts to county control. Access roads remain public until a new vote is held." Walter exhaled slowly. No cheers, no applause, just correction. "And Councilman Brooks?" Walter asked. There was a pause. "He stepped down," the supervisor said, "effective immediately." The call ended. Walter stood there for a moment, looking out across the melting snow and dark soil pushing up through it. Ranger walked over and pressed his shoulder against Walter's leg. "It's done," Walter said quietly. "Not a victory. Just done." That evening, the ridge felt different. Not tense. Not divided. Just quiet. A truck pulled into the driveway near sunset. Walter stepped onto the porch as Eli Parker climbed out, hat in hand. "Heard the news," Eli said. Walter nodded. Eli looked around the yard, then back at him. "That road's staying open. My dad would have liked that." Walter didn't know what to say to that, so he said the simplest thing. "I'm glad." Eli glanced at Ranger, who stood calmly beside Walter. "You staying?" Eli asked. Walter looked at the house. The boards still needed replacing. The porch sag still needed leveling. The basement still held boxes of documents that would go back to the county records office soon. He thought about the first night. The welded steel. The rock in the yard. He thought about Daniel Mercer writing alone. And about Ranger lying across that basement door like a sentry. "We're staying," Walter said. Eli smiled faintly. "Good." Over the next month, small changes came. No ceremony. No ribbon cutting. Walter removed the boards from the windows one by one. Let the light in properly. He repaired the porch support. Repainted the trim in a muted gray that matched the sky. He cleared a section of the garage and set up a small workbench. Word spread slowly that if your tractor wouldn't start, or your gate hinge snapped, Walter Hayes would take a look at it. No charge. Just parts and time. Older ranchers began stopping by with small problems. A carburetor that needed cleaning. A chain that needed welding. They didn't talk about the land deal much. They talked about weather. About cattle. About sons who moved away. Ranger moved among them like he had always belonged there. Children who came with their grandparents knelt to scratch behind his ears. He accepted it with patience, guarded the yard without making it feel guarded. One afternoon, Martha Doyle drove up with a stack of county forms. "Records office wants the originals," she said. "You keeping copies?" Walter handed her the metal box. "They were never mine," he said. Martha studied him for a long second. "Mercer would have liked that," she said quietly. When she left, Walter carried the empty box back down to the basement. The shelves were bare now, just concrete, just quiet. He stood there a moment, listening to the house settle around him. It no longer felt like a witness. It felt like shelter. He climbed the stairs and stepped out onto the porch. The sun was low, stretching long gold lines across the field. The snow had melted completely. Dark earth showed through, ready for spring. Ranger lay at the top step, head up, eyes scanning the horizon. Walter sat beside him. No phone buzzing, no engines idling at the road, just wind moving through open land. Walter reached down and rested his hand on Ranger's head. "We're staying," he said again, softer this time.
Ranger turned once again the wood, not loud, but certain. The house on Ashwood Ridge wasn't the one nobody wanted anymore. It was the one that snaked being earned. Walter didn't win a fortune. He didn't become a hero. He simply chose to stay when staying was harder than leaving. That's a lesson. Sometimes the strongest things a person can do isn't fight louder. It's refuse to walk away when something quiet and important needs protecting. Daniel Mercer tried to stand alone. Walter didn't. A stranger he never left his side. Not in war, not in snow, not in doubt. Loyalty isn't loud. It's steady. It's show up every day, even when no one is watching. This story isn't about land. It's about responsibility, about how healing often begins the moment we decide to stop running. If you had been in one place, would you have taken the money and left? Time 0 for leave, 1 for stay. And if story about loyalty, second chances, and quiet strength matter to you, consider subscribing. There are more waiting on the next bridge.